Hi, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Kelly from the Association of Corporate Counsel Australia. In the spirit of reconciliation, ACC Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. If you are not currently a member, please consider membership to continue to enjoy the best events for in-house by in-house. We're honoured to have Stephen with us today, and I'd like to hand over to him now. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and welcome to everybody. And thanks for taking the time to spend this hour with me talking about the future and how the world's going to look in a post-COVID world. First, I'll say a few things about myself. I am the former managing director of Facebook in Australia and New Zealand. I was with Facebook for many years. My role was to help set up the Asia Pacific business for Facebook and then to run the Australia and New Zealand business. I was with Facebook from the early days when we were a much smaller company. Today, Facebook's 40, 50,000 people, a huge business. But I was one of the first sort of adults brought into the company, as it were, to help sort of set up the business side of Facebook. And so it was a wonderful and fascinating ride. And I was very lucky to work with some talented people over that period of time. But what I really did see and had a first, sort of set at the front of the roller coaster was around how disruption and technology just change businesses and change whole industries. There's no question Facebook, Google, Amazon, a lot of these tech giants have done this over the past few years. And what's interesting now about the period we're going through is, how are all these technologies accelerating the change that's happening, particularly now that the world has been so upended by this crisis that's descended on us from COVID. So what I want to do today is spend about 40 minutes or so just looking at a bunch of themes in that area and starting to think through what could be the implications for the businesses and organizations that we work in, the implications from a business, strategic business model, and also obviously a legal perspective. So we'll crack on, and then towards the end, I'm going to have time for questions and a little discussion. Now, before I do, I mentioned my time at Facebook. It's always good to throw up a photo. Somebody actually said to me, "You worked at Facebook, so prove it." So I said, "Okay, well, here's a picture of me and Mark." And this was back in around 2012 or so. And you'll see Sheryl Sandberg over on the left-hand side. And we can't underestimate the impact that a company like Facebook's had on the world. But it's not the only business that's having these effects now. And Facebook's a good example of a synthesis of technologies coming together that has been so disruptive. So if you didn't have the iPhone, you wouldn't have Facebook. If you didn't have artificial intelligence, you wouldn't have Facebook. If you didn't have big data analytics, you wouldn't have Facebook. If you didn't have the ability of the internet to connect millions and billions of people around the world, you wouldn't have Facebook. It's essentially the nexus of all these technologies, and then the kind of smarts of Mark and other people sprinkled on top is what has brought Facebook to be. And I think that's one of the lessons that we've learned in the past few years is it's not one technology that changes things. It's actually a mix of things that brings these disruptions. Now I spend my time on doing a few things. One is I spend time with audiences like you and before COVID, on stages, talking to big groups about this digital disruption. I work with some of Australia's biggest companies on this issue about how to handle the disruption that's going on in the world, both from a strategic perspective and also from organizational and leadership perspectives as well. I have two companies that I'm CEO of. One is called the Digital CEO, where I work with some of Australia's biggest businesses around this issue of digital disruption. And then the second, recently founded, is a company called Omniscient Neurotechnology, or just Omniscient. That's a business I've co-founded with a couple of neuroscientists and neurosurgeons, and we build an atlas of the human brain. Essentially, we're looking at the brain as a big data problem and building products to, we think, transform our understanding of the human brain. So interesting shift for me from social media now over to sort of brain technology, but it's all of a piece in the sense that it's just taking me in the direction that technology is taking me. And before I get into it, I just want to tip our hat to everybody out there. I would normally be with you in person. We would know each other. I would see your faces. I can't even see you. And I hope you and your families are doing well. And I hope that you are in a good stage of your whatever quarantine that you happen to be in at different parts of the country. I hope you're surviving. Okay. Let me get into this. Now, first, just a caveat at the beginning. Uh, we are in the middle of a disruptive crisis, and it's really hard to predict what's going to happen, right? And the long-term view is what I'm trying to sort of unpeel here, not necessarily short-term effects, but thinking more long-term about what's going to happen. And I refer back to history here, and the French Revolution. I actually studied history in university. You know, took place back in the 18th century, and famously in the early 1970s, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, the American president, went to China to try to open up China. And they were having a conversation with Zhou Enlao at the time, who was one of China's leaders, and it was Nixon or Kissinger famously said to Zhou Enlao, "What do you think the impact of the French Revolution has been on history?" You know, this another famous revolutionary, and his answer was, "You know, it's too early to say." And I just think this is really instructive. You know, these are big changes. Even after, you know, hundreds of years, it's hard to say what the impacts of some of this stuff is going to be. So take all of my predictions or my forward thinking with a grain of salt. So I want to look at 7 themes today, and I like thinking about the world in terms of themes. So let me just give you the headlines here, and then we'll go through each one individually. The first is, you know, social distancing, you know, could become the law, and we're starting to see that already. The second is that people are removed, particularly from businesses and from processes. The third is that ecosystems and supply chains are going to become pandemic proofed, or will need to become pandemic proofed. The fourth is data and technology are going to step in to enable quick scaling. The fifth is that privacy is going to be redefined. The sixth is remote working is going to accelerate. And the seventh is that outside of even technology, globalization is going to take a hit. And this will have implications as well for technology and for how we use it. So let me just take a little deep dive into each one of these to give you a flavor. We could spend an hour on each one or more, but I just want to give a kind of around the park here. So let's talk about social distancing. Now, we are in the midst of pandemic one, in a way, COVID-19, but there could be other ones around the corner, and they may not be 100 years away. And I think what the world is learning is we are not necessarily prepared for these types of pandemics in our health systems and our social structures and our economies. And so it's not going to be like we get over COVID-19, there's a vaccine, and then we say, it's all over, let's get back to normal. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think there's going to be elements of social distancing that are going to become standard and in fact become legally enforced throughout the world. And so what we're going to have, I think, is we're going to have a patchwork of this. You know, we've seen this in other regulatory environments. Obviously, the world is not one jurisdiction. It's hundreds, in some cases thousands, when you add cities and counties and states into the equation. So we're going to have a lot of uniformity problems around this patchwork, and it's not going to be static. It's going to keep changing. We've seen this just in the past few months. You know, even I can't keep up on what's the law right here now in Sydney about what you can and can't do in terms of social distancing. And I run a business here, and I'm trying to keep on top of it. So this patchwork is just going to become a nightmare for business around the world, but unfortunately it's going to be, you know, the way things are going to be if we're going to deal with bracing ourselves for the future pandemics to come. The third thing that's going to happen is testing and certification are going to become requirements for individuals, for organizations, for businesses, for governments. And I think there's going to be a rise of businesses here that are going to be in the certification and testing business, to be able to certify companies, organizations that they are pandemic safe or pandemic proof, or they are in a position where they're a safe working environment. You look at workers' comp or workers' rights. You know, workers don't want to go back into environments that aren't certified for being safe in the current environment. I think that's going to continue. I think the default is going to become this. Businesses are going to continue to want to do business with you, but they're not going to want to touch you, right? And touch, in inverted commas, they're going to want to do it in such a way that it ensures that this level of testing and certification can be maintained. There's tons of implications of this. It takes, you think about any industry and how this sort of social distancing becoming mandated affects that industry. The implications are tremendous. So this sort of theme of I want your business, but don't want to touch you, I think it's not going to go away when this pandemic is over. And so all this is going to cause huge disruptions. In the short to medium term, we're already seeing them, but I think in the long term, these disruptions are not going to just go away. And there's going to be a struggle for some businesses, some governments, and some elements of society to adapt to this new normal, this new reality. We're going to see retrofitting of existing assets and processes, which is happening already. We're going to see redesign and new investments in new areas, new processes, new assets, to adapt to this new normal. And then I think, unfortunately, there's going to be some industries and businesses and sectors that are never look the same. And some of them may disappear completely, at least in the form that they exist today. And this is a long list. This is not a complete list here, but it goes on and on. Retail, real estate, transportation, tourism, education and entertainment, sports, healthcare are all being drastically affected. And I think that will continue to happen with this social distancing being mandated. But on the good side, I always think of the good side of things. I think we're already seeing there's a wave of innovation that will come about new technologies and business models that will be enabling this new social distance economy or this no-touch economy. We're starting to see this with drone delivery and no-touch delivery from certain delivery services. We're starting to see this with the huge adoption of touchless payments, even in physical retail environments. We're going to start to see this in other novel ways about how products and services are designed and new business models come into fruition that deal with this new social distance economy. So that's the first theme. The second theme is around people being removed, taking people out of the equation, particularly when you're making a product. People are still important as customers. They control their economic units, they control the money, they make purchasing decisions or influence purchasing decisions all around the world. So if you're in business, you obviously have people or organizations that are run by people as your customers. But the thing that's going to change is that even though the people are important as customers and will continue to be, I think they're going to be seen as liabilities as employees. And I think in the cold light of day after this, many companies are going to start to reconsider, what's my mix here? Do I have too many people inside my company and not enough automation and robotics and AI replacing these workforces? This was a theme that was already there before the pandemic, but there's no question. I think this has added renewed emphasis and impetus to this going forward. We are going to see robotics, AI, and automation start to replace more people in workforces and in industries that we haven't seen it in the past. This is going to accelerate the shift of workforce demand towards what we call higher cognitive roles. So people are still going to be important, but the reality is that their roles are going to become the ones that are things that machines can't do. And these are the higher cognitive functions, where collaboration, creative thinking, strategy, these sorts of things are important. And that's where the highest value and the highest demand will be. And there will be less demand for anything that's machine replaceable or AI replaceable. And as I say, I think there'll be more. I'm in AI now. I run an AI business. AI is making amazing steps right now, amazing progress in being able to replace so many different types of human roles that I think this is going to be a big theme over the next few years and very disruptive to many companies. So those companies that are dependent on human workers to get their stuff done, to create their products and services, in a sense, are going to bear a pandemic risk in the future. And so there'll be a discount that investors, employees, customers, suppliers, any partners that do business with these companies will be taking into account when they choose to engage with, to work for, or to do business with these companies. There will be, we will start to look askance at companies that are too pandemic risky, and part of the risk that they will have is going to be, well, how many human employees do they have, and how well will those humans be able to withstand another pandemic scare? So let me turn to the third one, ecosystems and supply chains being pandemic proofed. This has come to the fore in a very pointed way. For example, when the US suddenly was hit with coronavirus and they looked around to discover that all of their ventilators and almost all of their vaccines are made overseas. They're not even made in the United States anymore. They're made mainly in China. And so that was a very pointy example, but it's not just with healthcare supplies. It's also with all kinds of things. Once a pandemic hits or there's a threat of a pandemic, your supply chains can be instantly disrupted. And this has happened across lots of industries. So I think every business in the world, particularly of any scale that works across borders, they have to assess their pandemic exposure, both internal in terms of how they run their business and external in terms of how they interface, particularly with their suppliers. Here again, legacy businesses are going to struggle to pandemic-proof themselves. They're going to have to make investments to change their existing processes, existing technologies. They're going to have to figure it out how to make that transition. But then you're going to get pandemic native startups that will pop up. So much like digital disruption, digital native startups are more nimble and they're lower costs and they utilize things like the cloud and digital tools. Whereas, legacy businesses are slower moving and they have all these old systems that have to change. I think the same thing's going to happen here. We're going to have pandemic native startups pop up that are born in the age of worrying about pandemics and being pandemic proofed, and they can have business models that are fit for purpose for this new environment. They might be selling the exact same product or service, but they're going to come at it from a different perspective and probably with a very different economic profile. So there's also going to be a push for suppliers and partners that we deal with to certify that they are pandemic proof in some form. Now, I don't know what pandemic proof exactly is going to look like, and I have no doubt there's going to be consultants and others that pop up to help make this happen. But there's no question that if you're plugging into 100 suppliers to deal with your supplying parts into your supply chain, products or services or components, you're going to want to know how are they going to stand up if there's another outbreak in their part of the world or in any part of the world. How are they going to be able to continue to supply me? Do I have enough diversity in my supply chain amongst my partners to deal with the disruption? How am I going to do that if it happens quickly? Is there going to be certification, auditing, ratings, that actually makes pandemic proofing, certifiable and something that can be audited? Just as increasingly now things like work practices can be audited, or sustainable or ethical sourcing of products can be audited and rated. There'll be third parties that pop up to do this. There'll be marketing around it. So, companies will start to advertise in one way or the other, either to business partners or to consumers, that they are pandemic safe and that they actually have a business that's rugged enough to survive if we have another, COVID-21 or COVID-22 down the line. Let me go to the fourth theme around data and technology. This has happened really quickly. We've had this massive global experiment now, and how do you quickly shift a workforce, literally billions of people, how do we shift them to a remote form of working? Now, imagine if this pandemic had struck 20 years ago or 30 years ago, before the internet was mature, before we had tools like Zoom and video conferencing, on demand, before we had 4G and decent internet speeds to be able to handle this kind of video traffic. Well, guess what? We would be in a lot of trouble. It's impossible for us to work remotely without these tools. So thank God for the internet. Thank God for services like Zoom, because they've been able to step in and companies have been able to scale really quickly, literally within days, to move their operations into a virtual space. So in addition to removing humans, businesses are going to be focusing on utilizing data and technology to be able to scale up or scale down quickly in the event of pandemic in the future. So not just Zoom, but how do we use things like the cloud? How do we use things like SaaS, software as a service, platforms as a service? How do we use advanced analytics and AI, machine learning? How do we use all these remote enablement tools, these collaborative tools that many of us are using today? And how do we make sure that we've got the training in place and people actually know how to use these tools if suddenly we have to shift gears to go back to a more remote way of working than we have today? And indeed, how do we make sure we train people today to be remote workers and remote managers? That's something that none of us have been trained to do, and we're all learning sort of on the job. So I think there's also going to be a push to use data and technology to shift fixed costs to variable costs. This has blown up a few industries right now, because where you've got big fixed costs, particularly, let's look at the, the retail industry. What's one of the biggest fixed costs? It's just property, right? They've got leases, or they got property that they own, and suddenly a pandemic hits, or there's a huge shift in consumer behavior that we could barely imagine just a couple of years ago. And all those fixed costs just, turn to nightmares, and they can't be variabilized quickly when you're renting space. Now, the solution to many retailers has been to stop paying rent or to negotiate a better deal with their landlords, but that can't be the solution every time this happens. You've got to have another solution. And I think increasingly we're going to see whole industries start to try to figure out, how can I use data and technology to shift these costs, get out of fixed costs, get into variable costs. And in fact, how can I use different legal structures to do this as well? So, we may well see, for example, leasing terms change dramatically. If we're worried about more pandemics coming, who's going to be signing these long-term leases? I think it could be difficult to get many tenants to do that. Then you've got things like cybersecurity, data privacy, digital ethics. These things are a little bit in the background, but they're very important. But as we shift more to this data and technology-based economy, these things are going to become even more important. So we're seeing it already. We just saw it in the past couple of months. We had the rise of these apps on your phone for tracking for COVID control purposes. And big questions there about the security of that, the data on those apps. Who sees the data? How private is it? How ethical is that for the government to have their hands on that data? What other purposes are they going to use it for? There's going to be lots of examples both across society and also in individual companies about this. So there's no question that cybersecurity and data privacy and digital ethics are just going to really increase in importance over the next few years. And finally, I think there's going to be an impetus for what I call a war for data that's already going on, but this is going to increase. I came from one of those companies that has been in this war for data for some time. Companies like Facebook and Amazon and Google, largely they're data companies, and they've created their trillion-dollar valuations out of the fact that they are data companies, and they're hoovering up lots of data around the world, and then they're turning it into useful products and value that they're then monetizing for consumer, for other businesses. But now, if the rest of the world starts to get on the data train, as we're starting to see, and I think this will accelerate, this post-pandemic world, it'll accelerate, the war on data is just going to increase. And so this trying to get your hands on more data, the right data, clean data, data that builds on the data you already have is super important, and everyone needs to get their head around, what does this mean for my industry and my company? And indeed, I don't use this word lightly. This era of surveillance capitalism is kind of upon us. Now, if I was speaking to you as an employee of Facebook, I probably wouldn't use that term, but it's true. We are now in an era where our data is littered all around us, and others are picking it up and using it to have a look at us and decide how they're going to use it to do different things to influence us or to make money off of us. So this is a very important issue that's not going to go away, and in fact, I think it's going to increase in importance over the next couple of years. The fifth theme is around privacy, which I just touched on a moment ago, but let's go a little deeper. I think privacy is going to be redefined now. I think we've been on this path for a while. If I came to you 10 years ago and we were having this chat, and I said, look, I want to talk to you about data privacy around your Facebook feed or Google, you would get a lot of blank faces, because people would say, well, what does that matter? Or what does Facebook know about me? Or who cares what Google sees in terms of what I type into a search engine? You fast forward to now, 10 years later, and guess what? We are all more concerned about privacy. Everybody is. Every consumer has heard about what happened in the US with the 2016 election. Every consumer hears about filter bubbles. Every consumer kind of sits there and goes, well, I was searching for something on my phone, or I mentioned something on Facebook, and suddenly, I get ads served to me someplace else on the internet that seem to read my mind. Everybody's aware of this now, but do we really know? Do any of us know who has data about us and what they're doing with it? Nobody does. Not even Mark Zuckerberg knows what others know about him and what they're doing with it. So this issue of privacy, I think, is going to be redefined radically in the next few years, and I think this post-COVID-19 is going to accelerate it. Individual rights to privacy, in many ways, are going to be overridden by governments' need to respond quickly across entire populations if these, as long as pandemics are a threat. We're seeing that already. So that's going to throw a monkey wrench into how privacy gets redefined for corporations and for individuals. And we're going to have this rise of sensor, camera, and bio-enabled tracking. If you go to China, you know, it is already here. This era of tracking is unbelievably pervasive. But we're now starting to see this around the world. You know, your own computer, your own phone right now is, in many ways, is tracking you, and there's multiple parties that are getting that data on the other end. This is only going to increase with the rise of sensors and cameras around the world. At the same time, there's going to be a push for individual e-health records and shared clinical data sets and forced compliance with government health standards. So this all is getting born out of the pandemic as well. It is ridiculous that you can go to your doctor today right here in Sydney and decide, hey, I want to go to the doctor across the street. I'm just going to change doctors. I walk across the street and that doctor across the street knows absolutely nothing about me, has no records, no scans, nothing. There's no shared records, no e-health record that I can carry with me. Yet at the same time, Google or Facebook know, you know, virtually everything about me. They can predict when I'm going to get sick, or if I'm a woman, when I'm going to get pregnant. They have that kind of data. It's just absurd. So we have to sort this out. So there's going to be a big push, particularly in the wake of this pandemic. We have been really, from a data perspective in healthcare, just woefully unprepared for this. So that is going to change in the next few years. And so what all this is going to do is accelerate, I think, this rise of the personalized data economy. There's going to be these individual data silos are going to continue. There's going to be these media echo chambers that will continue, and these individualized experience bubbles will continue. But with one big difference, that people will take a lot more control and be much more aware of what's going on in those data silos. And at the same time, sorry, I got my bullet points in the wrong order there. I think we're going to see the collapse of mass marketing. So for those of you who are involved in businesses that are consumer-facing, sort of mass marketing, consumer-facing businesses, and that's a big chunk of the economy, that's going to be challenged. It's already being challenged by digital media. It's going to be further challenged by the rise of this personalized data economy. In fact, to the extent that I think we're going to see the demise of the mass, even though Facebook and Google are targeted media, I think we'll see the demise of their business models, because it's going to be very hard for them to reach consumers on an individual basis, because I think consumers are going to start to hide behind digital walls where even Facebook and Google can't see them. So those are the big themes around privacy. And then finally, I'd toss one in sort of even beyond this. I think this is going to lead to some sort of redefinition of governments. Again, governments get redefined every generation or two about what they do and don't do. But I think the role of government in our lives, I think, is going to be redefined again in this post-COVID era. And we're kind of seeing it in real time right now. There's things that governments are doing around the world or trying to do that were almost unthinkable just a few months ago. That's not just going to go away. I think the way, if there's one entity that can and should step in when a population-wide pandemic hits, it is government. And so we've got to have our governments much better prepared, and we're going to have to cede probably more control to them around some of our data in order to make that happen. The sixth theme about remote working. This is familiar to all of us who are on this call right now, and so this is probably the most obvious one. But I think there's a few outcomes that may be less obvious. I think right now we're learning lots of lessons about what works and doesn't work in this remote working economy. Some of these are trivial lessons, trivial, such as, hey, what's the best background for my Zoom meeting, and what's the best way to get everybody's face on the screen, and should I turn on or off my camera, all this sort of stuff. But some of them are going to be much more profound in second and third order effects. So for example, how do we manage our workforces when they're all remote? How do we incentivize them? How do we build culture? How do we monitor them? There is a level of monitoring that all of us do informally when people are in the office, but now we have to find a way to formalize or digitize that. So there's lots of things around how work gets done that we're going to have to start to figure out. The tools that we use to do this, there's no question that they're kind of good today, but the reality is I think they're going to get a lot better in the next few years. Virtual reality, augmented reality, visualization, of data using things like 3D visualization, the rise of 5G, which is going to improve all the crappy kind of video signals we get on these calls, the rise of more software as a system, sort of platforms, things like e-learning, which is still in many ways quite primitive and crude, the rise of collaboration tools, and then, as I mentioned, the rise of more sophisticated employee monitoring tools about this, and employee sort of effectiveness and efficiency tools. All these things are happening right now in the technology space, and some of these are buzzwords we've heard for a long time. Some of these things are here now. SaaS is a thing. 5G is arriving. But virtual reality and augmented reality have kind of been, the promise hasn't been fulfilled. But this will push the promise forward much faster, because now we have a real use. We have a 7 billion person use case for virtual reality and augmented reality, which is this: video conferencing in this two-dimensional world is really, really unsatisfying, and virtual reality can help solve that. And so I think if we come back 10 years from now, I will not be talking to you through this screen. We will be doing something in much more virtual, real, photorealistic, natural environment. The third point is that we've got a problem here in that we do not have good managers and leaders for dealing with these remote workforces. If you think about yourself and the team you're in, how were you trained as a leader or manager, either formally or informally? It was to do things face to face. Yeah, sure, you had email and chat and a few little, tools and systems you use, but you were with people, and you were managing people and meeting with people and talking to people face to face. Suddenly we've shifted to this new world, and we're not all going to go back in the office after this. There's going to be some sort of hybrid model. And so we have all these managers and leaders, literally millions of us, who are not trained to do this. I've worked in technology for years. I worked at Facebook for years. I wasn't trained to manage my entire team, just purely using video conferencing and other remote tools. I have to learn new skills, new tricks, and I've been in this industry a long time. There are so many leaders and managers out there who are struggling and are going to continue to struggle if they don't get proper training. And we're going to have a new era, a new generation of managers come up that are born into this world and are probably going to run rings around some of our existing leaders. And I think a bigger point around just leaders is about being remote dexterous as a company. We're getting big shifts right now. And if I just take an example, and I don't want to pick on this industry, but I'll just take a banks as an example. You've got 4 banks in Australia. Let's say 2 of those banks, and those 4 banks largely, up to today, they're kind of about the same. I know there's differences, but essentially they all have the same products and services, and they get things done in the same way. Slight differences, but they're all pretty similar. Suddenly the pandemic hits, and everybody's got to go remote, and everybody's going to remain 50, 60, 70% remote for the foreseeable future. It could be, it'll be years. We'll never go back to all working in the office. So what does it mean? It means the playing field has suddenly shifted for all 4 of these banks. So over time, what's going to become important is which of the banks is good at being remote dexterous and which one's not. Let's say 2 of them get very good at training their managers and leaders at being good at managing and leading remotely. Let's say 2 of the banks become really good at being able to do collaboration and strategic thinking and higher cognitive stuff remotely, and they figure out the tools to do that and the formula to make that really work. Let's say 2 of the banks are really good at retaining people and creating culture and creating stickiness to their culture, even if people are working remotely. And let's say 2 of the banks are not good at all those things. Well, over time, you will see a separation of the performance of the 2 banks that are good at it versus the 2 banks that aren't. And that performance is going to be reflected in things like the share price and the profitability and the revenue growth of those companies. We are at an important inflection point now with the basis of competition. One of the bases of competition in the future is going to be how remote dexterous your company has become. And so that's something that every company on earth has got to start to figure out. You're not just coping with a crisis anymore. You're competing with your competitor who may be becoming more remote dexterous than you, faster than you. Next point is about the rise of remote service-focused businesses that are going to come out of this remote working, environment that we're in, and we're seeing this already. E-commerce exploding, voice commerce was already taking off. That's going to start to continue to accelerate. drone delivery, home delivery, touchless delivery, whatever you want to call it, is exploding. It's going to continue to be there. Remote health and how that gets delivered to people. I have a business that's in the medtech business and medtech industry now. You know, being able to actually consult with and do diagnosis and even do surgery remotely is becoming a thing. Is going to be even more of a thing in the future. And then, you know, remote learning and education and learning and development. Again, a lot of those tools are crude, and a lot of those platforms, you know, are basic, but they're gonna be, you know, transformed in the next few years as the demand for even things like university. You know, how are we going to get students into back to classrooms? How are we going to get students back into high schools? It's going to be tough while pandemics haunt the earth. And so, you know, remote learning and e-learning is going to have to improve in the next few years. And then finally, we need to think about the second and third order effects of these disruptions. So, you know, on all kinds of industries, and I've just put a few in here. You know, you look at just take transportation for an example. You know, look at the car industry. I used to work in the auto industries. Maybe some of you guys are involved. And you know, look, the auto industry has risen up, and its whole infrastructure and sales model and production model has been risen up and based on one important assumption, which is that people are going to move around the way they've moved around more or less for the past 100 years, but just, you know, every year is just like a 1% change. People drive a little more or a little less. Highways get a little better or a little worse. You know, public transport systems change a little bit. You know, work changes a little bit to become a little more remote, you know, 1% at a time. Well, guess what? This pandemic is not a 1% change. It's a 50% change in all of those factors, or whatever percentage you choose. And so that blows up everything. I mean, if you're not driving to work the way you used to, if you're working from home, well, maybe you don't need two cars, or you're only driving that car you used to drive 40,000 kilometers a year. You're only driving it 10,000 kilometers a year, which means you don't really need to replace it every 3 or 4 years. You replace it every 6 or 7 years. This had huge downstream effects on an entire industry, you know, all the way back to the auto factories in Japan and Europe and China, which are not geared up for this supply, this sort of demand. So industry after industry, if you think about the second and third order effects of this disruption, just taking remote work alone, it is profound. And it's really, you know, again, we could spend hours just on each one of these individual industries, just talking about what some of those effects are. We're seeing the early days of it today, but the long-term effects in any industry you're in, I would urge you to sit down and really try to think it through and map it out, because they are going to be absolutely profound in the economics of the industry that you're in. And then finally, let's go to our old friend, globalization, which used to be a nice word, but, you know, has become a dirty word in recent times. What's going to happen here? Well, supply chains are going to come under scrutiny. We're already seeing it. We're seeing it not just from a kind of a nationalistic perspective, but just from a security perspective around pandemic proofing things. Putting more things under your control in your jurisdictions could become more important. And then you'll overlay on top of that some of this, you know, nationalist rumblings we're getting out of countries like the United States and others. I think there'll be a shift from just in time, which has been obviously a huge enabler of the global economy over the past few decades, to something a little different. And it may be something like strategic stockpiling. So it's not about just having just what I need for, you know, this week or this month, and that's it. I don't keep anything in a warehouse. No, I've got to keep stuff in warehouses. I've got to have stockpiles. Now, some of these might be virtual. So, you know, a rise of, again, new business models that actually maintain, you know, stockpiles and warehouses of strategic supplies for you, so that you actually buy, you know, you buy options on these on supply without having to keep it in your own warehouse, but you've got options in the event of a pandemic or some sort of sudden shock to the system. So thinking that through, and then thinking about how that gets enabled by technology and data as well. A fundamental thing is travel is actually right now is impossible. International travel, even cross-border travel within countries, within states, even some cities are locked down around the world still. Travel is just going to be hard. This isn't necessarily a technology issue, but it's going to spur the rise of other technologies such as video conferencing that we're on today. But This is a tough one. I mean, as I say, I've just founded another business. Our biggest markets are the U.S. and China. Our head office is here in Sydney. Luckily, we're very good at using virtual tools, and we have been for a long time. But at the end of the day, you know, there are customers we have to go and see physically. There's stuff we have to do when we go and see a hospital or a doctor or a customer. And you know, I'm worried about how we're going to be able to achieve that. And it's going to hamper our growth if it goes on long term. Things like data, technology, AI are increasingly becoming strategic national resources. This is absolutely true in China, where they've made these explicit national priorities. In places like the United States and Australia, this has probably been less so, but I think it's going to rise up the politicians and our leaders' to-do lists to become much more important about, you know, it's not just about the iron ore in the ground or the oil, you know, under the earth. It's going to become about, you know, what are the data assets we have, the technology, what's the AI that we control, who are the smart people that we have that can make use of these tools and these technologies, and you know, and how are they better or worse than people in other countries that we compete with. I think we're going to see a little bit of a risk factor here that could get built into some companies as well. Businesses that are diversified, that cut across some of these lines of global competition that are emerging today, or global tensions that are emerging, you know, could be viewed as more risky. Again, I face this with my own company that I've just started. We have business in China and the U.S., and we're here in Australia, and we kind of debate, you know, how at risk are we if we have the split between these two markets in China and the U.S. You know, should we be leaning in more to one market than the other? How should we talk about this to investors? Is it going to expose us to you know, trade wars? You know, will we get caught up in some of the trade issues that are happening now between the U.S. and China, or Australia and China? So, and that could place a risk premium on us from investors in the future. So that's a factor, unpredictable, out of my largely unpredictable, and I can't control, but I definitely need to think about and strategize about. Immigration slowing. It's ground to a halt in some countries, sadly. In my view, I think my personal view is immigration's the lifeblood of so many of our economies, but that's just my opinion. But immigration is slowing now around the world, or it's being redefined, or the redefinition is accelerating because of this fear of pandemic or recession or national interest. How that's going to unfold is going to impact the companies we run, the organizations we run, in terms of the talent we can get our hands on, in terms of some of our employees are going to be impacted immediately, or their families will be. So we're going to have to rethink our talent profiles in the companies that we run in the face of these immigration changes. And just more generally, I think suspicions are growing around the world. Hostility between countries, unfortunately, is maybe on the upswing. There's other forces that have nothing to do with the pandemic that are already there. You know, natural rivalries between countries, between systems, between ideologies. But I think we went through a few decades where it swung in one direction. The world was a friendlier, more cooperative place, but it seems to be swinging back. The pendulum swinging the other direction now, and we may have a few you know, years or decades ahead of us of greater suspicion and hostility, and all the second and third order effects of that. So that's my quick run around sort of the things that are on my mind and what I think about when I talk to my clients and in my own businesses. These are the 7 themes that I think are good to take back to your own organizations and your own teams, to think about what are the implications here, both from a business, organizational, and a legal perspective. And as I'm sure you can see, when you sort of take this sort of view, you know, the issues come thick and fast. There's no shortage of different things to consider. And I hope this has given you a good lens for taking it back into your own businesses.